People who have heard deathbed confessions, what were some interesting ones?
My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at that time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him, respectively. He was 98 years old, and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out one of his invisible sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my granduncle. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons. The one passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talking about a few degrees of separation,
My time to shine. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away, such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an East Germany company. He told me that he once run over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during the Second World War and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time.
This isn't a confession, but I just wanted to share the last thing my grandfather said to me before he passed away due to lung cancer. I was about to go to Rome for a school trip, and my family told me to go to set my mind on something else for a few days. Before I left, I wanted to say goodbye, as it was possibly the last time I could talk to him. He told me, "Have fun, boy. I'll see you next week." I went to Rome, and when I came back, he was already in a deep sleep due to medication. He wanted to peacefully pass away while sleeping. I came back the next week, and he was sleeping when I went to visit him. I told him everything I did in Rome, even though I knew he wouldn't wake up. The next morning, he passed away. My grandmother said to me, "He waited for you. I still miss him so much."
My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad she didn't remember who her family were and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were and claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one, and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end was that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully, and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone, but she didn't know where. He'd died some time earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. "My John will be home soon," she would say, or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say, "Thought that was my John." It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital, and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me, but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her, and that her husband, my granddad, had gone already. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way, that writing this just tore my heart out. I miss them both so much, but I know they're finally together again somewhere.
I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, She had collected owls. Literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them. We just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the doc said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember, but from there someone got her an owl to match, probably a pot holder or placemat, and all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early.
Okay, so this involves some spiritual paranormal shit that people might not believe, but it's still a cool story. So bear with me, technically not a confession. But the last convo she had with my parents, my great-grandma passed when I was 12. She took care of my mom instead of her actual mom, and lived with us because none of her sons or daughters would take care of her. So we were the ones who stayed there for the whole year where her health deteriorated. She had Alzheimer's, but it went on really fast, so she constantly snapped in and out of consciousness. It was easy to tell because her eyes weren't focused most of the time. A week or so before she passed, she told to my mom that someone visited her. At first, we thought it was just my mom, and she didn't remember who she was, until she said, full-on focused, "It was my mom. She came here to see if everything was fine." At that point, we knew there wasn't much time left. My mom mostly seems to be very involved into the spiritual things. She has seen shit and knows a thing or two. It seems people get visited by loved ones that passed, and they make sure they are calm and ready. On the same week she deteriorated was faster, barely talking. She just wasn't there. It seems one of the last things she said to my dad was at that point, he was there just guarding when she snapped in and just told him, "Take care of them for me, okay?" Component placement. He told her that he would. It wasn't even a question. And she went back out bonus section of the story. A year or two ago, a family friend passed. She was friends with my great-grandma, and my parents went to visit her because she didn't have much left. My mom and her had a talk and got in check. Even when she was ready snapping in and out of consciousness, they told me at some point when she was out, her eyes basically snapped and my parents froze because those were the exact eyes of my great-grandma. She looked at my mom and told her several times she loved her, before she looked at my dad and just went, "Are you taking care of them?" It seems she asked my dad twice, and he is still mad because he felt like she was questioning him and didn't trust him or some shit. He starts fuming when we talk about the story.
Not quite a deathbed confession. When I was in high school, I had a school project to interview someone interesting. I asked my dad for ideas, and he arranged for me to interview his old radiation biology professor, now a quite elderly man. We talked about his work, which was very interesting, but then he began to discuss his WW2 experiences. He was a sailor on a corvette in the North Atlantic, protecting convoys against U-boats. He was talking about how the service was simultaneously really boring, physically difficult. It sounded like the weather was always bad, and the corvettes bobbed about in the huge waves like corks, and also terrifying. But then he started talking about how, once when he was on watch, he got into a fight with a fellow sailor. Over nothing, really. And the other sailor fell head first against the steel wall of the ship and was knocked unconscious. The professor said he was terrified he'd killed the guy and would be punished for it. It was at night, during a bad storm, and the two were alone with no witnesses. To cover it up, he dragged the guy to the side and simply pushed him into the water. The next day, he was missed, of course, but everyone just assumed the other fellow had fallen overboard by accident during the storm. Apparently, this wasn't unheard of, and no one ever suspected him. I was pretty stunned by this revelation. The guy was confessing to a murder he'd committed, albeit many decades ago. Needless to say, this account did not make it into the school report. Ideas are the beginning points of all fortunes.
I worked as a night janitor in the children's cancer ward at my local hospital. There was a little boy, about 6 years old, laying in bed, and he called me into his room because he wanted help adjusting his pillow. He was hooked up with wires and stuff, so he couldn't roll over to place the pillow how he wanted. Figuring I'd be allowed to do it since a nurse wasn't really needed for it, I parked my cart outside of the room and went in. In the room, he started asking me different questions about my job. The first being, was I a nurse? I said no. He asked me if I seen his mom in the hallway and told me that she'd gone down to the cafeteria to get him strawberry milk and a donut. I said no to that too. He was quiet for a second. Then he looked me right in the face and said, "If I pass away soon, I hope that my mom is not sad." That hit me, like really, really hard. This kid was 100% aware that he could die and his mother would be affected by it. I didn't even know how to feel, so I told him that he wasn't going to pass away and hundreds of people survive cancer, which is a big number to someone that young. I left shortly after and broke down crying in the bathroom. A few days later, I was wiping down the wooden support railings along the walls of that hallway, and his room was closed for cleaning plus disinfection. That sign is only hung outside of rooms when someone dies.
My great-aunt passed away a couple of years ago. She was suffering from viral encephalitis and fluctuated in and out of consciousness. It was truly painful to watch. Although a lot of family tended to be around her in those last days, I once happened to be alone with her when she made some fairly odd remarks, which I kept to myself since. On the day in question, I was playing games on my phone in her hospital room when she started to audibly mutter to herself. It became more urgent and intense. Eventually, she explicitly called me to her side. Her eyes looked huge and confused. I doubt she knew who I was. She spat out her words, most of which were barely comprehensible, putting particular emphasis on boy and ingredient. I sat there for 15 minutes, listening to her erratic account of, as I finally gathered, how she sometimes used to cook eggs in the urine of a stable boy, instead of water. She insisted that he was handsomely compensated for his services, but now and then she started to cry and couldn't stop. I googled this weeks later, and there indeed exists a traditional dish in China described in the West as virgin boy egg. Apparently this concept had fascinated her, and she frequently recreated this herself and served it to her family, which sometimes included my younger self, without explaining what it was. I am not sure if she felt shame or enthusiasm about this. She often stammered something about the secret ingredient, but it quite obviously haunted her towards the very end of her life. Nothing dark, but unexpected for me. I spent a lot of time with my 90-something-year-old grandfather in his final months. He was married to my grandmother for over 70 years and told me he never slept with any other woman. This was followed by him asking me what it was like to sleep with more than one person in your lifetime. He, partially paralyzed from a stroke at the end of his life, also told me, as he was waking up from a nap, that he was just dreaming about having sex with Betty Grable. I never shared these details with my family.
Not a confession, but a denial and solid information that helped us clear a few pending matters. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency. We covered major felonies, some of which relate to organized crime. Not mafia per se, but open-ended criminal enterprises. We had a mid-level player as suspect for a string of cargo thefts, robberies, etc. Knew him for years. Arrested him several times. He taunted us a fair bit. Lung cancer got hold of him before we could build a solid case. Things went downhill fast. Went to see him at home just before he transferred to hospice. That he did at least 50% of what we suspected is an open secret. I knew it. He knew it. For whatever reason, chose to give me a break. He said, "If I give you something, will you sit on it for a few weeks?" Initially, I could not agree. What if he was going to leak info about something in progress, etc.? He assured me that it could wait. I agreed. So, he said, "I know that you are looking at me for the... Why, I didn't do it." He admitted wanting to do it, told me who was responsible and where we could find solid evidence to implicate 5 to 6 people. Why did he tell me? Said the other guy. Never treated anybody right. Did not ask him to elaborate. I moved on the info about 3 weeks later, after the informant died. Never had to share info source because he pointed us to substantial corroborating info.
I wasn't there to witness her confession, but the story leading up to it is intriguing. My mom was adopted, and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mom like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days, though, info like that wasn't exactly the easiest to find. My mom and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to info on each of their biological parents, or was elsewise requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mom found enough info from notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, some property info one can find at the library, and she just sort of pieced this puzzle together over her life. At a certain point, she was able to get the names of her mother and her brother's mother. She was able to find out she was part of a big family, with lots of brothers and sisters. But, for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she had gathered all of this info and found this much out, my mom was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found that led to it, or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. That phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called, and the voice of a young boy answered. My mom asked for the name she knew, and she hears, "Yeah, 1 second. Hey, Mom, phone's for you." My mom and her mom talk. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just going to refer to my mom's mom as Bio-Gran from here. Bio-Gran is not comfortable with my mom contacting her at all. She doesn't ask my mom a lot of questions, but my mom says that she was just going to talk, and if Bio-Gran wanted to hang up at any point, she could. My mom just gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. Bio-Gran after that would send letters to my mom on occasion, but Bio-Gran made a point of telling my mom she could never be found out by the rest of her family. And Bio-Gran carried that secret with her until the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away that time?" And Bio-Gran finally confessed. She had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mom, the child of her affair. I've met 2 of my bio-aunts, and sadly both of them passed a few years ago. But dang, TLDR, my biological grandmother had an affair with a milkman, left to go to a home for unwed mothers, had a child, did not tell her family until her deathbed.
I didn't witness this personally as it was between my grandfather and his father. My great-grandfather was not a nice man. He beat his children. One time he beat his daughter with a table leg, and I'm assuming did the same to his wife. Anyway, she left him and the kids behind. This was the 30s, and I am assuming that he didn't allow her to take the kids with her, and it's not like women's rights were great back then. My grandfather left home at 8 years old and fended for himself for his entire life. On his deathbed, Nasty Grandpa told the boys that he had a bunch of money stashed on the old property, and if they went to see him, he would tell them where it was. No one went. Edit for clarity. Nasty Grandpa was my great-grandfather. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say, "Used to be a whorehouse there." Empty lot. Used to be a building there, and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down. We passed by this old, odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a crib, and each door had a small room behind it, and each whore had her own room." We passed under a railroad bridge, and he pointed a flat area, and there used to be black woman that ran the best whorehouse in the state right there. I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing."
My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. Health was always good, but a benign tumor deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age went septic. He was dead a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there was a falling out between him and my grandma several years before, so we stopped seeing them. Funny enough, though, I constantly ran into him at the store and we always had nice chats. Anyway, in the hospital, he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he's ever known was dead, and he was ready to die. The week he felt himself getting sick, he knew something was off and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He took care of her with her Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't die until he knew she was taken care of. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church and then sat in the car and waited for her. Hated religion, but loved his wife Loelle.